proposed to take 10 and 11 together. A decision was taken in 2017 to fund and run cross-government public information programmes centrally. As a result of this, in the period between Q4 of 2017 and July 2018, several public information campaigns aimed at improving citizens' lives, such as the Healthy Ireland campaign, the Project Ireland 2040 campaign and the Self-Employed Benefits campaign, were run and funded centrally from my department. This was a departure in approach from previous years, when such campaigns would have been led and funded by the relevant line department. The amount spent on these campaigns for 2018 was 1.8 million. Included in this figure is the spend on the purchase of space in various media, including print, digital, cinema and radio, etc., as well as creative production. This is greater than the amount spent in the years between 2011 and 2017, but it is not a like-for-like comparison, precisely because of the decision to change the approach and to centralise such spending. Over 90% of the 2018 spend was occurred prior to July 2018, i.e. in the first half of the year, as campaigns were being run and funded centrally during this time. Following a budget cut of 2.5 million in mid-2018, public information campaigns are now funded by the relevant line department, as opposed to being funded centrally by my department. This is a reversion to the previous practice under previous governments. The spend on communications for my department in the years 2011 to 2017 inclusive varies significantly year on year, from a low of approximately 6,000 in 2014 to 580,000 in 2012 and 100,000 in 2011. The figure for 2011 includes expenses associated with the management and logistics for the public attendance for the visit of President Obama and the National Day of Commemoration. The figure for 2012 includes a public information campaign on the Stability Treaty. That's the fiscal treaty. Given the change of approach to the funding of campaigns, it's not intended to fund large campaigns from my department in 2019. Therefore, the spend for 2019 will be very significantly lower than that for 2018 and will be sourced from the administration budget of my department. It's not possible to give an indicative figure as to what the outlay will be, as this will depend on factors such as whether there are any significant inward state visits, and whether events, for example, the outcome of the Brexit negotiations, require some additional communications expenditure.
Burton.
Well, I think one of the most striking things, Taoiseach, about your government has been your absolutely dedicated focus on public relations and on spin. And I'm just not sure if you had to withdraw the Strategic Communications Unit that your government overall will quite withdraw from the public relations field. So what I would like to know is that recently we were told about the massive overruns in the Children's Hospital, and I think you indicated that cutbacks in the Department of Health alone would amount to 50 million, and that cutbacks collectively in other departments would amount to another 50 million. So what I would ask you, Taoiseach, how much of a cutback is the Department of Taoiseach going to take in order to help with the funding of our very badly needed and very badly budgeted for Children's Hospital? Is your department, because you were the line minister when these initial estimates were made, do you intend as Taoiseach to take any responsibility into your own department rather than making service departments which give services that are vital to people, whether education or other elements of service, whether they will bear the brunt of the cuts, but the department of the Taoiseach won't have any significant share in the cuts that have been announced for other departments, and in particular I think the cuts that are scaring a lot of people, the indications that it may be impossible to replace worn-out machinery and facilities in hospitals that badly need replacement.
Brendan Howlin.
Thank you, Lascan Cora. Can I ask the Taoiseach, could I welcome the clarity that he's moving back to the traditional way that health promotional initiatives are actually funded by the Department of Health. Education initiatives are funded by the Department of Education. Because notwithstanding the fact that you say that your initiative was a new departure, taking the budget line, if you like, away from line departments, You spent 290,000 on promoting Healthy Ireland, yet the Department of Health own promotion was not diminished. It was as well as, not instead of. You also spent €30,000 on videos promoting the budget last year. So can I ask you, what communication plan does your department have for this year? You say that obviously some things might be unknown. For example, will there be a referendum this year? Do we know? And will your department be involved in expending money on that? Have you decided on that yet? And in relation to, so I can be clear on it, normal line department expenditures like Healthy Ireland, are you telling us that your department will no longer be involved in any expenditure on co-supporting or co-funding promotional videos or social media in relation to those matters?
Deputy Micheál Martin wishes to.
For well over a year, we've been seeking a statement from you about what protections are being put in place to prevent the abuse of public funding to promote members of government personally and to link to political priorities rather than public priorities in terms of communications. Before this government, Taoiseach advertising was not undertaken for basic announcements and speeches, but this is becoming common practice. This appears to be part of your stated objective of finding a way of balancing journalists who you believed or who you believe are too negative. In the past, you did promise me that you would publish guidelines on when paid promotion may be undertaken. You have failed so far to do this, and will it be done any time soon? I just would make the point in that context, Taoiseach, you know, that who decides on which publications get allocations to do magazines on various issues? Yesterday there was a very fine piece from the Irish Times in terms of the centenary. Very large publication. I think it was funded by the Department of Culture and the Arts. I don't know whether other newspapers got the same access to that, what happened in broadcast, but who makes these decisions? And I ask it because I know when we got freedom of information documentation well over a year ago, the then Arts Minister, Heather Humphreys, was very clear. She was making the personal decision as to how much money each publication would get. But that's open to abuse, Taoiseach. No one's going to refuse public funding. It should be far more transparent, and it should be set guidelines and set rules in terms of how allocations of that kind are made. Because otherwise the government's open to the argument that it's currying favour through the use of public money. Call a spade a spade. And the last time I raised this, you know, certain people were very annoyed that I raised it in the media world. But I think there needs to be transparency in terms of this issue. And I think people, then I have no issue with funding being put aside, a general sum where public service obligations of that kind can be met by the print media, but it is done in a transparent, arm's length way and not at the behest of a government minister or the government itself. And I think that's fair, and that's the way, that's where we should be heading towards. And in terms of, you know, the NDP last year, all the advertising was about various projects and specific plans. The most mentioned was the new hospital. That was the biggie in the NDP. We now know that that has had a huge increase, as I mentioned earlier, over 1 billion more than was provided for in the NDP. 1 billion more than was provided for in the NDP, Taoiseach. Yeah, you know, close 9% of total capital held provision. A lot of the plans, by the way, of other hospitals haven't moved at all. You mentioned inflation was a factor in that cost. So does that mean the maternity hospital is going to go up dramatically? Does it mean other hospital projects are going to go up dramatically? So where stands the NDP for health now in terms of what we've witnessed today in terms of the Children's Hospital?
And Taoiseach will have about 4 minutes.
Confirm when the referendum on the extension of voting rights in the presidential election will be put to the people. It was raised by...
Taoiseach, you have 5 minutes.
I'd like a direct answer to that.
Taoiseach will have 5 minutes to respond.
Thanks very much. Just in relation to these matters generally, government will continue to engage in what government should do, which is policy formation, programme implementation and communicating with the public. And all of those things work together. You can't get your policies across the line if you aren't willing to communicate them, and programme implementation in itself requires a degree of communication. So government will do all of those things, as it always has: communicate, form policy and drive the implementation of those policies and programmes. And they all marry with each other, in my view. They can't just be separated. In terms of the National Children's Hospital overrun, the increased cost this year is anticipated at about €100 million. 50 of that will come from the Department of Health, and the other 50 will be spread across the capital budgets of all departments. I'm sure that will include my own, although I'm not quite sure what sort of capital budget we have for this year. It is important, though, to see that in context. The total capital budget for this year, the amount we're going to invest in our public infrastructure, is up 25%. It's up to about €7 billion. So we have to reprofile, defer, delay, however you want to describe it, about €100 million out of 7,000 million euros. So I've absolutely, and anyone who's been involved in government and running government departments, you will regularly reprofile your spend, and 100 million out of 7,000 million is a reprofiling that will cause some projects to be delayed. But I'm absolutely guaranteed that the level of scaremongering about what isn't going to get done or what might be cancelled will go well beyond anything remotely connected to reality in terms of what we'll have to do to find that additional funding for the Children's Hospital. It is the case at the moment that the cost of projects, capital projects, across the board are escalating in cost, not just government projects but also in the private sector. That has a lot to do with the tender price inflation, a lot to do with the fact that construction is going well, and there's a shortage of construction workers, and increases in material costs and increases in pay costs and professional fees. So it is a just statement of fact that the cost of construction projects is rising, and not just for the Children's Hospital. And that is, of course, a cause of concern for us, but not necessarily something that's entirely under our control. And you can really only know the cost of a project when it goes out for tender. And I think one thing we're going to have to consider when it comes to large projects in particular is not actually making the final decision as to whether we're going to go ahead with them until we have the final cost. And that hasn't been the practice in the past. The decision is made to go ahead. It's never the case that the final decision, or what we may need to consider, I think, for larger projects is only when we have the definite final cost, that tender in. No, it didn't. Yeah, but that wasn't the final complete project. And a tender, yeah, not the tender for the final cost of the project. That only came in more recently. Just in terms of the question on communications plan for this year, we don't have a communications plan in the department for this year, but I'm sure that there will be lots of things happening that may require the involvement of the department in communications, at least around Brexit. That can be done by my department or by Department of Foreign Affairs. The affordable childcare scheme is coming in later in the year. We need to make sure people know about that. It's a very significant increase in subsidies for childcare. And the extension of subsidised childcare to middle-income families in particular. So there'll be lots of reasons as to why we'll need to speak to the public over the next couple of months. However, most of that will be done, all of that will be done by the line departments. But where something crosses more than one department, then my department may have an involvement in it. No decisions. No, there's no plan at present on communications, as I said. I think Deputy Martin asked who decides which publications get which advertising contracts. I don't know who decides that, but I do know it isn't me. I've never made a decision of that nature. I don't think that's. I think I had that explained to me, and I think your understanding of that or the way you're spinning it is not in line with the facts. I think that answers the questions.
Thank you, Taoiseach.